to the World Soccer Talk podcast, the only podcast about watching soccer on TV and online. Welcome to episode 166. Coming up on this week's show, DOJ busts Fox for paying bribes to win World Cup TV rights. We share our favourite soccer documentaries of all time. Liga MX debuts FIFA 20 league matches live on TV. Which was better, MLS 1.0 or MLS 3.0? Plus we have letters from you, the listeners, in our Mailbag section. I'm Christopher Harris, aka The Gaffer, and I'm joined alongside my co-host, Kartik Krishnaiyer. Kartik, where shall we begin? Let's begin with what you've been watching this past week. Obviously, there's no live soccer on unless you're watching the Belarusian Premier League, which some of those games are now actually on YouTube, so I think they're live streaming it to YouTube. But other than that, that's about it. I know Nicaragua is playing. I think Turkestan is playing too, but obviously those are leagues that are not available on US television, at least legally. And we've got we'll get to it in the news section too. We've got the Bundesliga talking about coming back in May. But so for you and I, and probably for the rest of the world and all the listeners, we've been watching a lot of on-demand soccer. What's been your on-demand watching from this past week?
Okay, so Sunderland Till I Die on Netflix. This is Football on Prime, which came out last August. I never finished the series. Comes back, and it's an Amazon original, right? So something that they put a big budget behind and highly advertised it. Comes back this week in 4K, at least on my Amazon Prime. Maybe it's been there in 4K all along and I had never seen it. So I started watching it again and it was really, really good. The episode I like the best is episode 3, which with its emphasis on the Bundesliga, with Bayern and Eintracht, the stories of those two clubs, and then also the kind of close-up profiles of Robbie Di Matteo and Chelsea and his career as a player, and then as a coach, culminating in the 2012 Champions League final in Munich, and Juan Mata, who, every time Juan Mata's in a documentary or on some sort of Premier League World Show, I just fall in love with the guy. He's got such an engaging personality. He's one of the most engaging footballers of this era. Yeah, he's a smart guy, both on and off the pitch.
Yeah. But
I think he's very bookish, which is why he comes across so well.
So this is football. I haven't watched any of the episodes. I've seen, not an ad, but I've seen it as I'm flipping through the channels on Amazon. I've seen it there. So what is it though, Kartik? Is it behind the scenes? Is it interviews? Is it footage?
Yeah, no, it's more interviews and footage. So it's not a fly in the wall thing at all. It kind of tells the story of fans in Africa in one of the episodes, I think it might have been the first episode, who are Liverpool fans and get up at ungodly hours there and gravitate to a local watering hole in unsafe conditions to watch Liverpool matches. It tells the story of fans and clubs in Latin America and in Asia. And then it has this episode on the Bundesliga, and there's a lot of Premier League content in it too. But it's more like what I would call a 6-part magazine program, right? It's like that kind of presentation. But they're long. They're not a half an hour like your traditional Premier League or Bundesliga magazine programs. I think each episode is an hour or so, right? Like most of these Prime and Netflix documentaries. The episode 3 that I was speaking of in particular. It shows the one thing I would caution viewers is they do have the footage of the horrible injury Di Matteo got in the European match for Chelsea that essentially ruined his playing career.
Right.
So they have a lot of old footage. They tell the story. They went back and tracked down some of the fans who went to the Eintracht match, the infamous Eintracht match in 1992, when they lost the league title on the final day to Hansa Rostock, who had already been relegated, right? And all Eintracht had to do was get a result against a relegated team to win the Bundesliga title. They lose that match, and the rest is kind of history. The club goes down the tubes. They become a yo-yo club for 2 decades after having been one of the top clubs in Germany in the 70s and had continued success in cup competitions in the 80s. That sounds similar to Manchester United. And unlike Manchester United's relegation, when Manchester United was relegated on the final day of this 73-74 season when they lost to Man City, they bounced back up a year later and were in the top 5 in the then the English First Division within a few years. With Eintracht, they just stayed mired in this thing. And so then they fast forward to the final in 2018 against Bayern Munich in the German Cup, and go through that, and they get their first trophy in 30 years, and kind of and they talk to some of the same fans. So that was really kind of neat. Mm-hmm. And that's but it's like a magazine program. It's not a behind the scenes documentary about a club at all. They spend a lot of time with Oliver Kahn. And Pierluigi Collina is in a lot of these episodes, and he speaks wonderful English. And now that he's not an official anymore, kind of the coolest thing about him being in all these in this series is that he's able to give his recollections of matches he officiated from kind of a standpoint of a fan or a player or a coach, because he is a football guy, right? He had to be very guarded and very objective. So that I thought was really cool, because we know now that guys like Howard Webb and others who have been Mark Halsey and others who've been Premier League officials are able to kind of Peter Walton's another one. He comes on ESPN FC a lot, able to give those sorts of reflections. So I loved hearing that from the great Collina. Yeah,
Mark Clattenburg too. So Sunderland Till I Die, you did mention briefly. That one, I think we'll wait until next week, just to have you finish off the last couple of episodes. I did watch it, the second season, and I recommend it. We'll go more in depth on that one next week. Some of the things I've been watching from this past week, I caught up on one documentary I surprisingly had not seen, and that was the one about Stanley Matthews on Amazon Prime. It's called Matthews. And it's such a good documentary. The way it's produced is high quality, beginning right in South Africa, which you would, for those of you who may not know Stanley Matthews' story as well. And actually, I knew his story, but I did not know this angle of it in terms of the South African angle. And that starts off for the first about 5 minutes or so, and then it goes into telling the history of this, which is arguably one of the best footballers ever to play for England, and one of the best English players of all time. And it ends, the documentary ends back in South Africa in Soweto. Really, really good documentary about not just about Stanley Matthews, but just also about how soccer has changed so much through the decades, and just seeing him walk through crowds, and with no security, or just to be someone who was so close to the people. Highly recommend it. Fantastic documentary. One of the best I've watched on Amazon Prime in quite some time. Kartik, I finally finished watching the 1982 World Cup documentary, the official film. Again, this one on Amazon Prime too. Going into this one, I think I remarked on the podcast a couple of weeks ago saying that this is my favorite World Cup of all time. And I think after watching this documentary, what it is, it's that one match, which is the Brazil-Italy game, one of the greatest games of all time, if not the greatest game of all time.
Yes.
As well as Italy doing well, obviously, with Paolo Rossi, and just, a great team. But watching this documentary, I started to think, well, actually, maybe that 1982 World Cup wasn't the best. Yes, it had some great moments in that World Cup. England's win against France in that opening game of that group, that was remarkable. But the more I watched this documentary, the final was pretty boring. There was more footage of the France-Germany penalty kick contest in the semi-final than there was of the actual Brazil-Italy game. And the way that it was edited was it chopped off the build-up play in that Brazil-Italy game. So you missed kind of the engaging play. So for me, I think what I'm going to do is go back and find a tape of Brazil against Italy from 1982 and watch the whole game from start to finish.
And I would advise, actually, also, because I did it, I did it in the NASL office one day, I want to say in 2011. I watched the entire 120 minutes of Germany It was one of the days during the off season, so it wasn't that I was slacking on the job. The 120 minutes of Germany-France, and didn't watch the penalties. And it was available somewhere at the time. It may have been FIFA TV, although I don't know that they did that in those days. But yeah, even in that match, they kind of edited out a lot of the build-up play, and they went right to penalty kicks. And this isn't a shot at that FIFA documentary or retrospective that was made in '83, right after the '82 World Cup. It's a shot at everything. I have noticed this time and again when there are cup finals or one-off elimination matches that end in penalty kicks. There seems to be, with the broadcast highlights, the condensed highlights, always some sort of emphasis on showing every single spot kick, but not everything else. And in fact, in This Is Football, they did show the entire penalty shootout, and that the one I was mentioning just now, of Chelsea Bayern Munich. However, I will also mention they had an analyst on, British analyst, I can't remember his name, who basically charted the probability of goals scored in each for Bayern and Chelsea in that match, and went through most of those chances. So they did do that as well. And he said, look, the probability was Bayern expected goals would be like 3.5, Chelsea 0.2. But this is the wonderful thing about football. It ended up being 1-1, and they go to pens. But that really annoys me about these documentaries.
I've noticed that though too, just during a regular Premier League season, where something may happen, a beautiful pass, and which led to the goal. And to me, oftentimes the pass was greater than the goal itself. The pass was just insightful, just something that just almost like magic in terms of just with a long range pass or an inch perfect pass, and then the striker with relatively easy chance to knock it into the back of the net. And then during the actual clip of that, the replay of that, you just see a portion of that pass. You don't see the full pass for all the beauty of it. And it's not until halftime or post-match where you might have, say, Robbie Mustoe that says, hey, let's go back and take a look at that pass. And then you see the pure beauty of that. I guess part of that too is like live production television with just, not a lot of time, and everything's been done on the fly. So, but yeah, I've noticed that too. That always irks me when we missed out on that. Now, Kartik, you've been going back in time to watch a lot of games from the past, and which ones stand out from you that you've been watching this past week?
Yeah, so I watched the '99 League Cup final. These are all games I had on DVD for whatever random reason. League Cup final between Spurs and Leicester, and unfortunately I'd forgotten that Spurs won because of a Casey Keller howler at the end of the match at Wembley. Keller, of course, would play for Spurs later in his career. Speaking of the U.S., 2 U.S.-Germany games from 1999 I watched. The U.S. versus Germany 3-0 U.S. friendly win in February of 1999 in Jacksonville. Unbelievable performance for the U.S., and that was the game that I think psychologically allowed us to put the '98 World Cup behind us. I do have to mention, though, part of the reason the U.S. had such ease in that game is, in theory, the fact that the German players used it as a holiday and went in beached in your neck of the woods now, Chris, on St. Augustine Beach and on Ponte Vedra and Jacksonville beaches, and were not mentally prepared to play this match. It was during the winter break in the Bundesliga, so it was an all Bundesliga team of German players. I don't recall if they had any players at the time playing in Italy or England, but if they did, those guys weren't on that squad. It was a completely Bundesliga team. And that's also why the U.S. had its full allotment of players, because at the time, other than the guys who were in the Premier League, and I think in '99, it would have just been Brad Friedel, right? I'm trying to think who else it might have been in '99. Harks was at Nottingham Forest. He wasn't in that game. But the rest were all MLS or Bundesliga players. So the 3 U.S. goal scorers, ironically enough, all played in the Bundesliga, which I think is kind of the attraction of that match, that the U.S. beat Germany with 3 German-based players scoring the goals, Ivan Karofsky, Claudio Reyna, and Tony Sane. Later that year, the U.S. played Germany in the Confederations Cup in Guadalajara, Mexico, and beat them 2-0. Really comprehensive win for the U.S., very easy win. this actually foretold the problems Germany would have in Euro 2000, where they were awful. They finished last in their group. They lost to England, actually, and England didn't get out of the group either, right? They finished third. But the German performances in Euro 2000 and Euro 2004, we so often forget because we kind of obsess about how great they were in World Cups until the most recent World Cup, always getting to the quarterfinals, always seeming to be there in the big competitions. But they haven't always been there in the Euros. And these two games in '99 kind of foretold the problem they were going to have the next few years. France-Brazil 2006 in the World Cup. This was a match that FIFA TV restreamed this week. I had forgotten. I don't want to say I'd forgotten, because I think a few years ago I may have, even on this show or the forerunner of this show, Chris consistently said he was the most impactful player in world football in terms of tactics, other than Xavi on Barcelona. But Claude Makélélé, his performance in that game blew me away. He's just always in the right place, always so graceful in how he wins the ball. His technical skill was so good. He changed how that number 6 position is played, right? You used to have a destroyer that would take people's legs out, and he wasn't that at all. Zizou was brilliant, and I would also have to say Lilian Thuram at the end of his career was still such a gracefully brilliant player. I think as we move with some perspective with history, Chris, and we think about France, we realize that maybe they are the preeminent footballing nation over the course of the last quarter century. We've talked so much about Spain and Brazil and Argentina and Germany. But there seems to be, when now I think about it, even when they don't perform well at the big tournaments, a greater production line of elite French players and it crosses generations than any sort of conveyor belt in any other country. I mean, obviously Brazil would be the closest competition there, but this just gave me another appreciation for France and how good they were. And then obviously Vieira and Henry were still on the team then. Henry got the goal. 2007 Man City, Man United. So I watched this game on DVD. I have a DVD of the old Fox Soccer Channel's coverage of the game, or the international feed. I then try and search on YouTube for a decent clip to post, and there are no decent clips on YouTube. It's just like all this grainy stuff. I also, by the way, watched the Win documentary about New York City FC, and that was excellent. And the biggest reason I'd recommend that documentary, one, it's not the classic MLS propaganda that you get from MLS documentaries like the LAFC documentary we've talked about and other things MLS itself produces. It's a real fly on the wall, behind the scenes look that also engages their fans in the build up to the first season and through the first season. I think the most interesting thing about it, Chris, is you get a much deeper analysis of what happened in the Frank Lampard situation. Them signing him, or City Football Group signing him going to Manchester City, him scoring for Manchester City. They document the meeting where Soriano tells Claudio Reyna, hey, he's staying here, and we know this is very difficult for you. They document the meeting between Jason Kreis, Claudio Reyna, and Lampard after he made the decision to stay at Manchester City, or after the decision was made for the rest of the season. They show the fan reaction. They show people calling and canceling their season tickets because Lampard was going to stay in Manchester and not be in New York until the summer. So they were pretty honest about all that stuff. The other thing I liked about it is when they showed the players that they had signed, they listed their salary. So part of it was you saw the difference in salary between your average American player, including Kiri Shelton, who's featured prominently in the documentary and is now playing in the Bundesliga, has really kind of made it big. He's at Paderborn, versus he was making $60,000 at the time, versus the DPs via Lampard, and then also obviously Mix Diskerud, who was on a high salary. So it was really neat, and it was a documentary that I enjoyed. I thought it was going to be just whatever. I don't really Care. It's another MLS documentary that will be propaganda-ish. It was actually quite good, and it showed some of the struggles the team had with their fans initially, etc. But it was well done.
Yep, and that one's on Curiosity Stream. Kartik actually wrote a really good article about Curiosity Stream, which is a streaming documentary platform for our sister website, which is comparestreaming.com. So check that out when you get a chance, and it goes into more detail about all the coverage that they have, soccer, and a whole lot more. All right, Kartik, let's move on to TV streaming news.
Yeah, in the midst of this shutdown, we got the huge surprise this week that federal prosecutors in Brooklyn unveiled new charges in the FIFA corruption probe, including 2 against former Fox marketing executives. Prosecutors say their involvement helped them obtain confidential bidding info for the U.S. rights to the 2018 and 2022 World Cups, which Fox won. And, of course, because of the Cole Cutter winter controversy that rolled over, they were given somehow a freebie, or not a freebie, but the add-on of 2026 without a competitive bidding process.
Exactly.
According to the DOJ's press release, 2 execs charged were responsible for developing Fox broadcast business in Latin America, but they also obtained confidential bidding information that helped Fox acquire the U.S. rights to broadcast the 2018 and 2022 World Cup tournaments. Could ESPN or 2DNA have a legal case against Fox regarding the rights to a World Cup? Per Sports Illustrated legal expert Michael McCann, and this is a quote, the awarding of TV contracts in a fraudulent bidding process means that a group of networks lost out on bids due to bribes and kickbacks. Attorneys for ESPN and other losing bidders likely read Monday's indictment with interest. It's not inconceivable they could weigh potential legal action over losing bids in a corrupted process. While the statutes of limitation for taking action may have already expired, remember this bidding took place in 2011,
and while
the process itself might have compelled bidding networks to contractually forego possible legal claims, it's within the realm of possibility that losing networks might explore the possibility of suing FIFA and related parties for fraud. They might even explore a case against Fox on a theory of vicarious liability, namely responsibility for wrongful acts by Lopez and Martinez, those are 2 individuals that were indicted that benefited Fox. So this is just a fascinating development, and I also found it kind of ironic, Chris, before I throw it over to you, that Grant Wahl, who worked for Fox for a number of years, is not there anymore, was kind of beating the drums about this louder than anyone on the internet, on Twitter. Like, boy, this is fraudulent. This is terrible. And I've written an article recently for our site about Grant Wahl being seemingly more independent and objective since he left Fox. This is yet another example.
Yeah, that article was talking about like how the best thing for Grant Wahl was leaving Fox, because he's now become very vocal about not just Fox, but also more importantly US soccer and kind of the steps or the mistakes that they keep on making, and being a vocal opponent to them. While he was at Fox, he was very corporate, let's stick to kind of Fox's agenda and not say anything negative on Fox television about US soccer. So yeah, this is a big story, Kartik. The thing that I want to focus in on is the question about could ESPN or 2DNA have a legal case against Fox regarding the rights to the World Cup. And I mean, what's left? So you got 2022 World Cup in Qatar. They'll be played in the winter. That's going to be played, from, I think, Thanksgiving roughly through till December. So it's going to be played at a time, conceivably, unless things change, during NFL games and, busy time of the sporting calendar, usually. So 2022 World Cup, I don't think that's going to be a big one for anyone in terms of TV ratings. And obviously 2018's already happened. The 2026 World Cup was handed to Fox Sports, where they were able to acquire the rights to that at a sum, but it's in a bidding process that there was no other bidders. It was only Fox. Fox came in and said, okay, we're willing to pay X amount of dollars for the 2026 World Cup. So I'm not sure even with the 2026 World Cup if an ESPN or 2DNA would have a legal case for that one. It is connected, but it wasn't. This was later. My thing thinking about this is that I don't think ESPN would be interested in doing any legal case against Fox or FIFA. I mean, Fox and ESPN have a pretty close relationship. They've worked together in the past quite a few times on some collaborations. But TUDN, obviously the Spanish language rights for the World Cup are with Telemundo, and TUDN, formerly Univision Deportes, are not on the best speaking terms or on the best business terms with Telemundo, and Univision Deportes, now TUDN, really were dealt a huge blow by losing the rights to the World Cup. I can see possibly on the Spanish language side, the lawyers at TUDN at least discussing or thinking very, very deeply about this one, whether there is a case for them to go in and try to acquire, try to get those rights back through a legal case. Imagine 2022 World Cup if you had Mexico playing in that World Cup and performing at a high level, what the TV ratings would be for that, even if it is during the winter, during a busy sporting time of the year in terms of the calendar. That's my take on this one. But yeah, a huge story that came out this week. Now, Kartik, speaking of TUDN, they've announced that they're going to be showing, beginning Friday, they're going to be showing live FIFA video games on TUDN. So what it is they've looked at the Clausura season in Liga MX and the games that would be playing, and they've gone ahead and set up a league that is going to be live streamed on television in Spanish. So unfortunately, there's no English language broadcast of these games, but what they're going to have is their TUDN commentators, in addition to Liga MX players in the broadcast booth commentating on the games. So you'll have, not this weekend, but you'll have Club America against Chivas. You'll have Toluca against Pumas. I mean, all these great Mexican teams playing it out live on television, going through the entire season. I think there's going to be 17 match days. A lot of the days are going to be back-to-back to games. You might have 2 or 3 games back-to-back. This will be an interesting experiment because I think in many ways this is one thing that we're missing out on English language television. So far, none of the English language sports broadcasters have shown any live FIFA games on television. And I think it's worth trying. And I know that Rocket League, the USL, is doing, and they're having some of those games on ESPN2, I believe it is, as well as ESPN3. But Rocket League is not soccer. FIFA 20, I'd like to see it. Let's try it. Let's see it happen. I know MLS has got a Twitch channel, but again, that's not on television. But anyway, hats off to Liga MX. They're calling it E-Liga MX and TUDN for making this happen. I'm looking forward to at least watching it and seeing what it's like and seeing if it's well produced or not. Meanwhile, Kartik, it sounds like the Bundesliga will be back in action in May, playing games behind closed doors. They don't expect to have any games with fans in the stadium until probably early next year. But they are looking to finish off the season. Not a lot of game weeks to go, but starting up in May, behind closed doors. What's your reaction on that one?
I'm a little stunned. I mean, I think Germany has done a better job, and I had a long conversation about this with our friend Nick Gieber the other day about the Bundesliga starting when we're both under the impression Serie A and La Liga may never play again this season, right? Seasons may just be done, and the thought is that you maybe have a one-off playoff between Lazio and Juventus for the title, and Barcelona and Real Madrid in those respective leagues. That this has happened now. Germany has done a much better job of containing the virus, and they have a much lower mortality rate once people contract the virus. So they are in better shape than Italy or Spain and the United Kingdom, where I think everybody knows there's probably more high-profile cases in the United Kingdom than anywhere else, including the Prime Minister. This having been said, once you've contained the virus, there's a fear that if you lessen the restrictions on social contact, then the thing might explode again. So these matches will be behind closed doors, but you have 20 players on each side, right, that'll dress. Mm-hmm. You have referees, you have staff, you have coaches, you have operations staff, you have groundskeepers, you have all these things to where you're going to have, I don't know, 150, 200 people.
Right, TV crews.
Yeah, TV crews. Yeah, thank you. Right, because that's the reason they're doing this. So I think they're running a horrible risk. Now, we know the reason it's being done is the Bundesliga needs to finish the season to satisfy its television partners. We also know that there are a number of clubs in that league, or in the league structure beyond Bundesliga 1 that are teetering on the brink because of the ownership model in Germany being so much different than the rest of the world, and something I embrace. I embrace the German model, but to me, this is really risky.
Yeah, it's the crazy thing though, Kartik, if this was the Premier League that had announced this, I'm sure there'd be a ton of people on Twitter, kind of outraged, saying that this is ridiculous. Because it's the Bundesliga, I'm not seeing as much complaints about it, for whatever the case is. But we're in a situation where a lot of these leagues have to figure out a way to finish off the season. So whether they just end it as is, and then fear the implications in terms of what's going to happen with UEFA saying, okay, well, if you do that, then you're not going to be in the Champions League. So the leagues are put into a situation where they have to figure out a way to finish off the season in order to fulfill the contractual obligations and in order to satisfy UEFA for the Champions League and Europa League. So then you put into a situation where you have to play these games. I'm okay with it as long as they can guarantee the health and safety of everyone involved in this. So from a TV spectacle, and we saw this in the first couple of weeks in March, where some of the games were played behind closed doors in Europa League and other leagues. The TV spectacle is awful. It looks terrible. It looks like it's behind closed doors, friendly, being played, and the level of football is good. It just there's no atmosphere, so I don't think a lot of fans are going to be that excited about watching these games, personally speaking. But if they can guarantee the health and safety of everyone, and how can they guarantee that? I guess with testing and just, the amount of energy and resources needed to make that happen, which then you're taking that away from maybe hospitals or other resources that desperately need that. I don't know. It just, it's an awful situation to be in. But other than just, that's pretty much the only way they can go about it, unless they say, okay, we'll just pull the plug and we're not going to play these games end of the season and to hell with it type of thing. It's a tough situation to be in, and for the leagues, the clubs, the players, everyone involved, and the TV crews, production, all of the people that work on this, it's difficult. I guess it's up to the leagues. If the leagues are fully confident that they can do it without getting anyone sick or spreading the disease, then do it and get it over and done with. All right, Kartik, moving on in the TV news section, and this is really not TV or streaming news per se, but we want to go through just some of our recommendations of some of the best soccer films and documentaries that we've watched, and this is in no specific order at all. But as we go through, just kind of a quick description of some of these. So, Kartik, I'll have you start off with one of your favorites.
Yeah, the 4-year plan, which is about Queen's Park Rangers after the takeover by Bernie Ecclestone, Flavio Briatore, and that group of individual owners in 2007 is a great documentary. They had a 4-year plan to get to the Premier League, and they made it, but. It's a classic fly in the wall documentary that shows just kind of the competing interests at the club, the tensions between manager and players, manager and owners, agents and managers and players, and really kind of walks you through, the entire process and the craziness of that club, because at the time the club was sacking managers left and right. They were paying a lot of money to get players in the door, and even at the end of the documentary, there's some uncertainty because they have been promoted to the Premier League, but they were awaiting a points deduction from the FA because they had registered Alejandro Farlan. There was claims that he was a third-party owned player, and I think a lot of people remember that controversy. So the documentary ends with the FA docking them. Not docking them points, but essentially fining them, right? Mm-hmm. And they get promoted anyway, and that's how the documentary ends. But you see the succession of managers who could not work with ownership. They finally decide, okay, we need to get an established manager instead of running through the Paulo Sousas, these young managers of the world, and the Jim McGiltons, who obviously was a good manager, but it didn't work out there, etc. So they go and get Neil Warnock from Crystal Palace. They have to pay Crystal Palace for it, and it's working out beautifully at first, but then the old tension arises. But Warnock gets them promoted in the end. So just really interesting documentary. I think maybe the first documentary that that I really liked in terms of fly-in-the-wall documentaries. This was made in 2012, so it's now very dated, but it gives you a look at the football league in the latter part of the decade of the 2000s, and how difficult it was, even if you threw money at things, to get a team promoted. If there was no consistency, there was no style, there was no just club culture. And there wasn't a club culture there at all.
I should add, too, that a lot of these recommendations, too, or some of the recommendations are from our listeners and followers on Twitter, too. So, and in addition to Kartik and I adding our recommendations in here. Next up is Victory, which is also known as Escape to Victory in some countries. And this is the film. If you haven't seen it before, definitely rent it or stream it, check it out. It stars, I mean, it's a fictional story about World War II and about American POW and British POW soldiers in a camp, and there's Nazi German officers, and they decide to go ahead and play a soccer game. The funny thing is it stars an incredible cast of people too. Everyone from Sylvester Stallone to Michael Caine, Bobby Moore, Osvaldo Ardiles, and I think John Walk. I think they took a bunch of the players from Ipswich Town.
Yes.
I think Russell Osman's in there. So you'll see a bunch of Ipswich Town footballers in the British camp here. But and then, of course, how could I forget Pelé is in this one too. It's really actually not the best film ever made, but it's one of the better soccer films. There aren't a lot of very good soccer films per se. Documentaries, yes. Films, not so much. But I enjoyed that one. That's an all-time classic for me. Sunderland Till I Die. Need I say anything more about this one? The first season, one of the best documentaries available on Netflix. Season 2 we'll get into next week, but to me it's worth watching. The next one is a personal favourite of mine. I think yours too, Kartik. The Damned United.
Yeah, it's funny. You and I watched that movie together for the first time, and we walk out with our friend Rami Sofi, and I was complaining about all the factual errors because I knew so much about Brian Clough's career. Yeah. But then I ended up being one of the first people probably to buy the DVD when it came out. I own it on digital now via Prime, buying a video, and have watched it probably 24 times because the filmography is that good, and it's still a great story, regardless of whether they kind of sandbagged the reputations of Billy Bremner, who had passed by that time, and Johnny Giles, who was very much still alive at the time, and Dave Mackay and others. To tell the story, it does get you in the kind of intense personal side of Brian Clough and his relationship with Peter Taylor. It does capture that properly. Some of the factual errors are that Johnny Giles was the person recommended by Don Revie to be the manager of Leeds when he left to take the England job. But Giles wasn't actually one of the players who undermined Clough. Bremner was. That was accurate. But Giles actually was on record saying, hey, I mean, I don't think 44 days is enough time for any manager. I would have given him till Christmas, basically. And then the Dave Mackay faux pas is that Mackay does become the manager of Derby. They do win. They do win the league under Mackay, right? If I remember correctly,
yep.
or the FA Cup. They won the league, but there were a couple managers between him and Clough, and Mackay, who recently passed away a few years ago, said, I never would have sandbagged him like that. I wasn't an active player anymore. The movie had kind of represented him as an active player. I had already retired. I was getting into management. Clough had gone to Brighton, and I took the job after that. And so there were some historical inaccuracies in there, and I think anyone who knows English football in the 70s will pick up on those, but it was still a fantastic movie, and Michael Sheen captured Clough so perfectly.
Yeah,
I mean,
what an actor.
This was at a moment, this film was released at a time when Michael Sheen had just come off of playing Tony Blair in multiple films and had just captured Blair, and had played David Frost in a great film, Frost Nixon. And he kind of played Frost in his own way. He didn't really resemble Frost, but he was still spectacular in that film, opposite Frank Langella, who was Nixon. And then this movie came out like 3 months after Frost Nixon. It was his moment. He's a great actor in film and in plays on Broadway, etc. But this was kind of his moment. And as good as he was as Blair, I think he may have even been better as Clough.
Oh, for sure, absolutely. And for listeners who may not have seen the film yet, I would thoroughly recommend the book too, because the book by David Peace, The Damned United, to me was even better than the film, and gets deeper into the character into kind of the mindset of Brian Clough. Just a spectacular book. Speaking of great books, Fever Pitch, the Nick Hornby classic, probably the greatest book about soccer ever written. This was turned into a movie in 1997 starring Colin Firth. The movie itself is not, I mean, the book is a million times better than the movie. The movie's not the greatest. It's well worth watching if you can find it. It's nothing to do with the Fever Pitch baseball movie, which was kind of semi-based on Nick Hornby's book. But Fever Pitch, the film, if you can find it, check it out. It's worth watching. And Kartik, because we have so many films still left on our list, we'll just go for a few more, and then we'll continue the list next time. But next up, The Two Escobars. This was a 30 for 30 documentary done by ESPN that talks about the intertwining stories of Pablo Escobar, the drug cartel leader from Colombia, and then Andres Escobar, the footballer for Colombia, who unfortunately scored an own goal in the 1994 World Cup between the United States and Colombia, a devastating goal for Colombia and a huge goal to the benefit of the United States. Really, it's a mind-blowing film to watch. I don't know if you can add anything more to it than I can.
Yeah, I thought that The Two Escobars was just, the filmography was so good, and it came out right before the 2010 World Cup, so it was ESPN by design put it out to kind of jump into World Cup 2010 coverage, and it did the job. I mean, so many casual sports fans I know watched, not casual sports fans, sorry, intense sports fans, but not into soccer, watched a film and then decided they wanted to watch the World Cup, even though it was a film about Pablo Escobar and the drug kingpins and everything of the 1980s and early 1990s and its connection to Colombian football. But it is worth noting also, for those who don't know, there was a moment in time when the Colombian league was more awash with cash than the other leagues in South America, and were storming through Copa Libertadores and et cetera after being a football backwater. Colombia developed later in terms of its football infrastructure than the countries in the southern half of South America, the Southern Cone, as well as actually probably even some countries in the north of South America. So it was really kind of a fascinating movie, and I highly recommend it.
All right, two more Kartik to go before we move on to the next segment, and that is the next up is, I think you saw this with me, right? In the movie premiere. This movie is called Pelada, and what they did was they went on a tour throughout the United States, showing at independent movie theaters. And oftentimes when they premiered the film in that different region, they'd have the director and producer in the movie theater to answer questions. And this is one that I remember, it was, for South Florida, it was a big deal because we had kind of all these people from the soccer world in South Florida. So you had, I don't know, Thomas Rongen, Ray Hudson, Jeff Rusnak, many others who came out to watch this movie. And it was a good way for a lot of us to catch up because it had been years that we hadn't seen each other because, losing the Miami Fusion with the MLS and the strikers kind of up and down, there wasn't as much of a community, but this brought people together. And it's a beautiful film. It's a film of different soccer stories from around the world. From I think Brazil to Africa, just showing how the universal language of soccer exists and how beautiful the game is. And the cinematography in this one is beautiful. The stories, not as memorable. I can't remember a lot of the stories. I don't know but you can't. But I remember walking away from this one having a really feel-good feeling about the beautiful game of soccer.
Yeah, it was quite a night for all of us because we all were able to congregate back together. Jeff Rusnak put it together. It was pretty amazing. The thing that that stands out for me was that we had Gwendolyn Oxley, the producer there, and she answered questions, and there was this portion on Iran that was really, really interesting from a woman's perspective. The other two things that stood out from that night actually were Ray Hudson reading poetry about Riquelme and Messi that he had written before we went into the theater. And then it happened to be the night. Remember, we're all in South Florida where we had this gathering in Hollywood that LeBron James signed with the Miami Heat, which was a surprise to a lot of people. And so we get out of the theater, everyone turns their phone back on, and it's, oh my goodness, we have this alert. LeBron, or text message from somebody, LeBron signed with the Miami Heat. So it was a really memorable night, and it was in the middle. Was it in the middle of the 2010 World Cup, or was it right before? I'm trying to remember. Maybe it was. I
think it was before.
Yeah, it was right before. So it was around the same time that two Escobars had come out on ESPN. So it was really kind of I have really fond memories of that summer of 2010. I mean, there was a lot of kind of good feeling in the soccer world, at least in South Florida that summer, with a World Cup going on, with everybody kind of congregating together. It was the period of time using that World Cup as a springboard. We launched NASL, and we relaunched the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. There was just a ton that happened that summer. Us getting together for that movie for Pelada was a big part of it. That was actually what started that summer of soccer for us. Yeah,
and for those who are interested too, so Pelada is PELADA, so check that out. Last but not least, Kartik, Once in a Lifetime, the extraordinary story of the New York Cosmos. This was a 2006 film that came out, and as far as American soccer documentaries, it has to be, the best, if not one of the best. Just a remarkable storytelling of the NASL and the highs and lows of that league, and just how amazing it was to think back to, the 1970s, where you had all the major stars from around the world playing in North America, in the United States. Imagine if that had happened. If that happened today, you'd have the likes of Messi, Ronaldo, you name it, coming from around the world. Haaland coming to play in the United States. How big of a deal that would be for the United States? And this is a documentary that really celebrates that and tells that story in a lot of detail. I always enjoy watching this one. I've watched it a few times. What about you, Kartik?
Yeah, I've actually saw it in the movie theater 3 times when it was out in the theaters in the summer of 2006. So that's how much I liked it. The first time, the day I actually had to go and there was a line to get in, was the first time I went, which was the morning of the Liverpool Chelsea Community Shield match in 2006. Immediately after, went to watch the film and watch it for the first time, and then watched it 2 more times before it rotated out of the movie theaters here. It was riveting. It was it recreated a lot of the nostalgia for the NASL. It was really the trigger on so much retrospective goodwill and good feeling about the NASL. The NASL had been buried in the 96 to 2006 time period as a failure, as a reason the U.S. had fallen behind in soccer. MLS now has come to rescue us, type of thing. And I think it changed a lot of people's thinking about that period. And you don't label something a failure because it fails at the end, when there were several good years before that. And I think that film did a lot to change people's attitudes. It also just showed how colorful football was in the 1970s, and this is something that you get from the documentaries about English football in that period, and the documentaries about German football in that period, and quite honestly, even from The Damned United. We talked about that film. It's kind of in the same period, a little earlier, a few years earlier than the bulk of Once in a Lifetime. The other thing I think it really did is it established the how do I put this? At the time when MLS would go into markets, they would, even if there was a long soccer history in those markets, they would rip out the history and they would call the team something else. And they tried to do it in Seattle, and the fans protested, and they ended up going with the Sounders. I think it restored a lot of the nostalgia and restored a lot of the feeling that we need to have continuity between that era and this era. So then suddenly, the Sounders, the Timbers, the Whitecaps get into MLS. They keep their names. We see the Tampa Bay Rowdies and Fort Lauderdale Strikers come back. We see other attempts. There had been talk of bringing the Detroit Express and Washington Diplomats and LA Aztecs back. So there became this, and the Cosmos, obviously, there became this kind of understanding that, okay, we don't need to hit the reset button in every market and make something fresh and new. Let's grab that nostalgia. Let's make it seem like there's a continuity. Now, there's some dishonesty in it, not in the film, but in that continuity. San Jose Earthquakes now, this version of the Earthquakes in MLS try and kind of embellish their history and say they say Quakes 74 everywhere. No, it's not the same club, but still, I think it changed a lot of attitudes in American soccer, that film.
Yeah, that's the thing though, Kartik. You and I have experienced this in different ways, and sometimes to get together. But what happens oftentimes when I have a conversation with somebody about soccer in the United States, and just a stranger or someone I run into by accident, the topic comes up about the NASL. And this happened, we met up for lunch, in early March, just a couple of weeks before all hell broke loose with COVID-19. But we had lunch to catch up, and the guy was asking us, hey, what business are you in? We said we're in the soccer business. And he was from Chicago, and he started talking to us about the Chicago Sting and about them playing these games and how memorable it was. And I think he asked, does Chicago still have a team? What is the team? And we talked about the team at Bridgeview and the Chicago Fire, and they're starting to come back a little bit. Now they're going to be playing games at Soldier Field. Isn't that good news? But the context of that story was all focused on NASL, the memories of that league, and just the crystal clear memories of just the celebration of how good those years were. And that happens all the time. When I run into people and start talking about soccer, it's oftentimes from the context of NASL, not Major League Soccer. And it is remarkable. And it's this documentary, if you haven't seen it, watch it. It is great history, but also I think it also gives us a better appreciation for what we have today, where we have a strong league, but also reflects back on how good things were back then too, in terms of in the history, rather than them being labeled as like you said, as a failure. It wasn't a failure. The end was a failure, yes, but during the height of it, it was incredible. Listen to Mailbag. We've got a few comments from our listeners. First up is Leo. Leo says, thanks for the interesting discussions, even in the absence of football. Only one quick fix. The Nicaraguan league is playing, even with people in the stadiums. And the Russian league showed the classic Spartak CSKA game from a video game on the Federal Match TV. And I think that's in answer to my question, I think last week, talking about how come there's no live FIFA games being played. I mean, FIFA, the video game, being played on television. So I guess in Russia they did that. Raymond Orozco says, do you think because of the financial problems that are occurring within league football in Europe right now, it may accelerate potential of Super League, particularly in Europe? I think, Kartik, I think all gloves are off at this point. I mean, everything could change once soccer gets back to normal, whatever normal is. I think all gloves are off. Anything could happen. Clubs could be going out of business. Leagues could be really hurt. The transfer market could be decimated. If there ever was a time for somebody to come together to figure out a plan to give clubs a financial boost with a Super League, this could be the time. Alan says, I have just finished watching the second season of Sunderland Till I Die, and I really enjoyed it. The word that I thought of most while watching the episodes was passion. The passion from the supporters was great to see, especially the youngsters. It reminded me of when I started going to games in the late 60s. Hoping that your team would win was everything. Passion was also showed by the money man in the boardroom. And I think, he says, I think his name is Chris, a bit of a Del boy. And I don't think his name was Chris. It was Charlie Methan, who's the director of Sunderland. Anyway, so he says he wanted to see Sunderland win, but his passion was business. For him, it could have been about any football team. All he could see were the pound signs. It was interesting to watch the two different versions of passion. Can you or Kartik think of any football documentaries that show a rising from the ashes type of story? Something like Manchester City rising from Division 3, or maybe older stories like Swindon coming up through all 4 divisions. Maybe Sunderland will win the Champions League in 15 years' time, and they will have this documentary to show everyone how far they have come. They will need plenty of passion to get there. Kartik, can you think of any Rise to the Ashes documentaries?
Documentaries, no. It would have been good to have one of Swansea, obviously.
Wait. Jack to a King, the Swansea story, the one that they showed on NBC over-the-air network. They got big-time ratings. I think over 500,000 people watched that one. How soon we forget? No, I'm being tongue-in-cheek here, but that is one I would recommend. It's on iTunes. You can rent it or buy it, and I'm a little bit biased on that one, though.
Yeah, so it would have been good to have, I think, a complete series. Where I'm saying, that's a documentary like the QPR one I mentioned, but it would have been good to have, these different season stanzas. I don't know if we'll ever quite – you have to get lucky, right? You have to pick the right club. Bournemouth, obviously, is another one, and et cetera. But there are I think when you look in again, going back to the 60s and 70s in English football, so many more examples of clubs that just kind of climbed the ranks and then ended up winning the league or competing for trophies. Luton Town is one. That was 1980s. Wimbledon before the epic collapse, right? And then obviously QPR, when they first got promoted in the late 60s under Gordon Jago, they ended up becoming quite an established club for the next 10, 15 years before falling back off. And then we obviously talked about them earlier in the show, coming back up. So there are a number of clubs you could make a documentary like that about. I think now one which would have been interesting to actually document in recent years would have been Aston Villa, because it is such a big club, but it is a club that at times in its history, this isn't the first time in its history they've underachieved historically, right? So they've had the highest of highs, winning a European Cup, beating Bayern Munich in the final. You talk about when you want to win a final, you want to win a proper final, right? You don't want to play some team from Poland, no offense. You want to play Bayern, Juventus, Real Madrid. And they've had kind of the lowest of lows too. So Villa, I think, would be an interesting club to see a documentary like that about. And who knows, once this season resumes, maybe they get relegated again. You have the chance next season to do a 6-part documentary on the season they push back for promotion, and then maybe do continue it if they get promoted again.
Yeah, and being as unbiased as possible too. Honestly, I do think that Jack to a King, the Swansea story, is well worth watching. A club that was near the bottom of the 4th division, one game away from getting relegated to, or at least relegated to the Conference League, kind of the non-league, or at least trying to stay away from that, and then rising up and almost going bankrupt, going into administration actually, and having the fans pull together the money to go ahead and keep the club alive, to be able to pay the players to keep moving forward, and then all the way to the Premier League and beyond. I think even if I wasn't a Swansea fan, I would recommend that one. Last but not least, Kartik, this one came in this morning from Ritik. He says, "Hi Chris and Kartik, how do you view the quality of the late 1990s DC teams that dominated MLS, especially the 1998 squad with the top franchises today, Atlanta United, LAFC, etc. I think the squad depth of the elite sides now is far better, but DC had a starting 11 which can rival any current MLS teams with players like Echeverri, Moreno, Harks, Pope, etc. Since this week marks the 25th anniversary of the first MLS match, I was intrigued to know your thoughts on how far the league has improved in quality." And Kartik, just an aside too, of course, a lot of the listeners, yourself included, know that I think it was last Monday, ESPN2 showed a bunch of classic games, and I think MLS2 on their website, I think it is, they've been showing a lot of kind of classic games from that period too. So Kartik, in hindsight, knowing teams like Atlanta United, LAFC, etc. now, and looking back to these 1998 teams, especially DC United, which ranks better, MLS 1.0 or MLS 3.0?
Overall, I guess 3.0. In terms of just the number of quality sides and number of quality players in the league. It's also a much bigger league. In terms of the best team in the history of the league, it's still, to me, hands down, that DC United team. And not only in the history of Major League Soccer, and I know a lot of people get angry when I say this, and we just talked about the New York Cosmos earlier. I think those DC United teams were probably as good as the Cosmos teams in the late 70s, early 80s. We'll never know. But you mentioned squad depth. They were actually deeper than people think, DC United. In fact, there were matches where they had a number of players out or called up into internationals because their whole team was internationals, their whole first 11. You mentioned Echeverri, Moreno, Harks, Pope. That's the spine. But they also had guys like Tony Sane, Carlos Yamosa, Jeff Agus, who were fantastic internationals. Jeff Onger at the time was a top international for Canada. Raul Diaz Arce, RDA, was the best Salvadoran player. He and Mauricio Cienfuegos was in a generation. Probably the best Salvadoran players of the last 30 or 40 years. They had a lot of squad depth, though. You would see guys like Carey Talley and John Maisner and David Vadrial and Brian Kamler step in to roles and play really, really well. I think those DC teams were really good. I think they were the best teams in MLS history. I do have to point something out, though, about this. MLS did not really strictly enforce the salary cap until the 99, 2000 type. And Ben Olsen, when he joined the team in 98, how could I forget him? Didn't really enforce the salary cap until they started breaking this team up. And once that team got broken up due to the salary cap, and you had Sane move to Germany, Pope go to the Metro Stars, Agus go to San Jose, they were just another team, right? So I think it's tough to compare because they were given more latitude in building the team. And in Kevin Payne and Bruce Arena, they had two guys running the club that knew more than everybody else probably combined in that league about finding players where they were, how to build. And then they kept it going with Thomas Rongen, who would be probably third on that list of people who knew what they were doing in those days when a lot of people in American soccer didn't know what they were doing. They didn't scout well. So it's tough to compare because I think it's much more difficult now. It's more competitive, and it's more difficult now to build a team that is that good, especially with a dispersed talent pool. I don't think our top American players are as good as they were in that era. I think the top players on DC United, you talk about a guy like Tony Sane, you talk about Harks, a lot of them were in the primes of their careers too. Eddie Pope, arguably the greatest U.S. field player ever, U.S. men's field player ever. You don't get guys like that in the prime of their career anymore who are American, one, playing in MLS, and two, they can't all be on the same team. And then you don't get DP level players like Moreno and Echeverri, two of them on the same team anymore. Yeah. So I say that team's the best. I think it's not really even that close. And let's consider they won CONCACAF. They won the Inter-American Cup here at Lockhart, in your former neck of the woods, beating Vasco da Gama. Still probably the greatest victory ever for an MLS club in an international competition. They won the league 3 times. They won the U.S. Open Cup a few times during that period. but I don't think you can recreate that team. The closest thing I've seen to it is Atlanta United, and that's probably the Atlanta United team of 2018 would probably, and 2019 under Martino and then De Boer, obviously they got knocked out in the playoffs, but they did well in other competitions. Is probably the runner-up historically.
Yeah. What I prefer about MLS 1.0 over MLS 3.0 is the super clubs. So you've got the DC Uniteds, you got the LA Galaxy, you got Chicago Fire. I mean, you had some really good teams that were well drilled, had some really fantastic players in their prime playing good soccer. MLS 3.0 is more of your, other than Atlanta United, which I agree with you. I say 2018 would be the kind of the top there under Martino. 2019, not as much, but you don't have the super clubs as much. And LAFC are inconsistent. Some games they look fantastic. The next game they don't look so good. So the quality level isn't there, in my opinion, on a consistent basis. And Atlanta United 3.0, that's great for MLS 3.0s. You have a good team there too, but not a lot of other great quality at a super club level. It's very, to me, parity is not a good thing. Parity makes things boring. I mean, you want to have those super clubs to kind of have those teams playing great football, but at the same time have those huge upsets where you have a team near the bottom that's be able to knock off the team at the top. That creates a lot of excitement too. So I have a lot of fond memories for MLS 1.0. I mean, there was a lot of poor games and a lot of players. Lothar Matthäus, especially as one example, mailing it in, coming over for a vacation, really playing MLS and looking horrible, not caring at all. But MLS 3.0 definitely has quality. Just it's a different type of quality. There's some great quality from South America and Central America playing in the league, but it's spread out a lot more where you have so many more teams, and the depth level, the quality level isn't as good because in 1.0 you had fewer teams and that quality level was more concentrated. So listeners, we want you to have your say. If you agree with us, disagree with us, want to have any questions or recommendations about soccer movies or documentaries that you want us to talk about in the next episode, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. You can always reach us via email through web at worldsoccertalk.com, as well as facebook.com/worldsoccertalk, and on Twitter at worldsoccertalk. Plus, you can always post your comments on worldsoccertalk.com. Kartik, did you want to add anything more about the MLS argument?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think there were plenty of players who came to the NASL in its heyday and mailed it in also, and were on holiday. But there were many also that weren't, that really took soccer to another level and entertained while they were here. So there was a lot of that in the early days of MLS, as well as we mentioned, and some guys that also were maybe too good for the supporting cast around them. I think of Roberto Donadoni coming to New York and being surrounded by a team of journeyman level American players, and Donadoni being miles ahead of them mentally, and just they couldn't read his movements, they couldn't understand what he was doing, and he went back to Milan, I think, after 2 seasons. Was kind of frustrated individual here.
And just a couple of quick items on World Soccer Talk news is that we have the next episode of the Heart of the Game podcast. It'll be coming out on Monday. This one is with Phil Bonney, the commentator for the Bundesliga. And Kartik, I think you will enjoy this one. This one's a really, really insightful interview with him that goes into a lot of detail, a lot of things I didn't realize about him. Him telling his story.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to Nate's interview with him. I, in fact, did not know who he was and kept hearing this call from this guy. And I think it was finally Derek Ray or Ian Joy or somebody on Twitter pointed out to me, this is Phil Bonney. You should follow him.
Yeah.
You should pay attention to him, because it was the same guy. And I was saying, well, this guy commentator is really good. I keep hearing him. So I'm looking forward to that. Really interesting guy. Very, very animated and kind of intellectual in how he calls a match. So I enjoy him.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of listeners too will definitely, when they hear his voice, will go, okay, that's the guy. And he tells his story about how he got into Germany. We also did the interview with Taylor Twellman this past week too. That's a must listen to. It goes into a lot of the politics of US soccer, and also the story of Taylor's rise as to be one of the best co-commentators on US soil. And one more piece of news, and that is with the worldsoccertalk.com website. We're going to be posting schedules every weekend of all the different games and soccer coverage that are on US television. So check that out too.
Oh, and one quick thing, Chris, and I should have mentioned this earlier in the show, since you mentioned Taylor's interview with Nate earlier in the week. Also, I checked out this week, and I would encourage everybody to find the clip. Taylor gets to interview his old teammate for Outside the Lines, Marshall Leonard, who is now his old New England Revolution teammate, who is now a doctor on the front lines of the coronavirus pandemic. An inspirational story, and quite honestly, this guy is a hero, and he's a longtime MLS player. He played for the Revs for 4 or 5 seasons, if I remember correctly. So check that out, Outside the Lines, from earlier in the week.
All right. Well, thank you for listening. You can get a new episode of the podcast every Thursday on practically every single iPod or podcast player, in addition to youtube.com too. If you like the show, share it with your friends on social media and give us a review on iTunes. We greatly appreciate it. And Kartik, heading into another weekend, what should people do?
Enjoy your football documentary viewing.